Max, what's on your mind?
Let's take a brief journey through history to explore the origins of women's oppression and how gender inequality has evolved over time. From prehistoric societies to modern times, we'll look at how women's roles have been shaped by social, economical and political forces. Let's get into it. Let's start prehistoric times, before 10,000 BC. Early human societies were based on hunting and gathering. There was no class system. Members in these societies were relatively equal. Both men and women played essential roles in survival. Women often were responsible for gathering food, which actually made up around 6% of the tribe's diet, while men focused on hunting. Women's primary role was child rearing, ensuring the survival of the next generation. These roles were vital as human infants were born more dependent than most animals, thus requiring extended care. Interestingly, in some tribes, women had significant influence, especially elder women. Sometimes they served on councils, making important decisions like whether to go to war. Tribes often practiced communal child rearing. Everyone in the tribe shared responsibility for their children, creating a cooperative and supportive environment. Around 10,000 BC, there was an agricultural revolution. This shift to farming meant humans could produce more food than they needed, leading to surplus resources. This abundance came with private property, wealth accumulation, and the development of social hierarchies. In these newly formed hierarchical societies, men began to control resources like land and wealth. This marked the beginning of male dominance in public affairs, and women's roles shifted from being vital contributors to child rearing and food production to being primarily focused on reproduction. Agricultural societies needed more workers to help in the field, so women's reproductive roles became more central. Women were seen as tools for producing more children to work the land, while men increasingly took charge of the economic and productive labour. From 3000 BC to 500 AD, ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece and Rome progressively limited women's rights. In Mesopotamia, although women's legal rights were often limited, women who were priestesses or queens had some form of power. In ancient Egypt, women could own property and hold political office, but the majority still faced restrictions based on their gender. In ancient Greece, especially in Athens, women had very few rights and were mainly confined to home life. Roman women had some legal rights, but they were still controlled by their fathers or husbands. Both societies became more focused on patriarchal norms that kept women in subordinate roles. In medieval Europe, from the 5th to the 15th centuries, Christian beliefs played a key role in reinforcing patriarchal values. The church taught that women were the weaker sex and focused on their roles as wives and mothers. However, it's worth noting that throughout history, some have misused the Bible to push their own agendas, leading to the misrepresentation of Christ, the oppression and miseducation of people, and for some, the loss of their faith. But let's get back to the topic. During this time, women faced increasing legal and social restrictions. They had limited access to education, property and political power. While noble women had some influence, most women were expected to focus on their home and families. The rise of feudalism, where land was exchanged for loyalty and service, also restricted women's autonomy, as men controlled most of the land and power. Skipping to the early modern period, during the 16th to the 18th centuries, this era was marked by colonialism, which introduced patriarchal systems to new parts of the world. As European powers expanded their empires, women in colonies were subjected to even more severe gender-based oppression. In these societies, women were often restricted to domestic roles, while European men dominated both the public and private life. Additionally, the intersection of patriarchy and colonialism created environments where violence against women, including intimate partner violence, became widespread, particularly in colonized nations. During the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries, while this period brought some women into the workforce, especially into factories, their working conditions were harsh and they were paid significantly less than men for the same work. Despite these challenges, the Industrial Revolution also sparked the beginning of organized movements for women's rights. Women started to rally together and fight for the right to vote, to have an education, to be treated equally to men, and have better working conditions. Jumping to the 20th century, where we see monumental shifts in women's rights, feminist movements in the 19th and the 20th century fought for key rights, such as the right to vote, work, and access to education. Women across the globe began to break down the walls of patriarchal oppression. While there has been a significant progress in many areas, gender inequality is still very much present in different parts of the world today. Women continue to fight for equal pay, reproductive rights, and an end to violence and discrimination. So, the roots of women's oppression was deeply connected to the agricultural revolution, where the rise of private property and wealth inequality began to shape social hierarchies. Over time, women's roles were restricted to domestic and reproductive tasks, and the patriarchal systems took hold. However, the years of inequality endured by women caused women to resist and create the feminist movement, which has been a driving force for change. The feminist movement, as previously stated, dated back to the 19th century, with its origins primarily in the fight for women's rights to vote. The first wave of feminism, which started in the late 1800s, focused on legal inequalities, particularly women's right to vote, own property, and gain access to education. One of the most iconic moments of the first wave of feminism was the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 in the USA, where leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott presented the Declaration of Sentiments, demanding women's rights, including the right to vote. This work paved the way for suffrage movements across the world. The next major phase was the second wave of feminism, which emerged in the 1960s and continued through the 1980s. This wave expanded beyond voting rights to include issues like equal pay, gender roles, and sexual liberation. Women like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan played a vital role in advocating for these causes. During the second wave, it also brought massive changes, including women entering the workforce in larger numbers and great opportunities for education and career advancements for women across the globe. Feminism also started addressing social structures and patriarchal systems that maintained gender inequality. This was also the time when the phrase, "the personal is political," became widely recognized, highlighting how personal experiences of women were linked to broader social issues. In the 1990s and beyond, the third wave of feminism emerged, influenced by intersectionality, a term coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. This wave highlighted how gender inequality is experienced differently by women depending on their race, class, and other aspects of identity. Today's fourth wave of feminism is largely driven by social media, focusing on issues such as sexual harassment and body positivity. It's intersectional, global, and emphasizes inclusivity, striving for a world where all women, regardless of their background, can have equal rights. So what's so powerful about feminism? At its core, feminism is about empowerment. It fights for the idea that all people, regardless of gender, should have the same rights and opportunities. Feminism has led to monumental changes, whether it's women in the workplace or equal education or the fight for freedom from violence. Feminism has also made great strides in combating violence against women, such as domestic abuse, human trafficking, and sexual assaults. Movements like the Me Too have empowered women to speak out about these issues and demand accountability. Additionally, feminism has been instrumental in breaking down traditional gender roles, giving women the freedom to choose careers, relationships, and lifestyles without being limited by outdated social expectations. Now, we all know no movement is perfect, and with feminism, radical feminism is a concern. Radical feminism, which sometimes appears in fringe groups, can shift the focus from gender equality to misandry, the belief that all men are inherently oppressive or even evil. This extreme form of feminism can alienate men and create a divide between genders, rather than working towards true equality. Instead of empowering women through cooperation, radical feminism sometimes encourages a view that all men are the enemy, which undermines the movement's foundational ideas of equality. Additionally, feminism as a movement has historically been criticized for its failure to fully address the intersectional experiences of women of color, particularly black women. While feminism's initial focus was gender equality and securing rights for women, it often catered to the concerns of white middle-class women, leaving the unique challenges faced by women of ethnic minorities marginalized or ignored. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, white feminists were preoccupied with issues like voting rights and legal recognition, but many did not extend their advocacy to the struggles of black women or other women of colour. Black women like Sojourner Truth and Ida B. Wells were early advocates for the rights of black women, but they were often excluded or sidelined by mainstream white feminist organisations. Sojourner Truth's famous Ain't I a Woman speech at the 1851 Women's Rights Convention challenged the feminist movement's lack of attention to the realities of black women's lives, highlighting the dual oppression of race and gender. Despite this, the feminist movement's leadership largely remained white, and black women's concerns were not always the priority. Now, at one time, the European beauty standards became so institutionalized that they were adopted even within the feminist circles. Black women, for example, were often told that their natural features like their coarser, curlier hair or darker skin were inferior. This led to the widespread idea that black features, and by their extension, black women, were less beautiful or unworthy of celebration. One of the most notable ways of Eurocentric beauty standards manifested was in the treatment of black women's hair. Natural black hair, coarse, curly or kinky, was often labelled as unprofessional, unruly, or unattractive. White feminists and social circles pushed the idea that straightened hair was the only thing that's acceptable for women, especially in professional environments. Not to mention the acceptance of colorism, the concept of lighter skin tone being more attractive and desirable. While white feminists were fighting for the right to vote, they often did not advocate for black women's suffrage or equal rights. For example, during the suffrage movement, some white suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony expressed racist views and argued that black men should not have the right to vote before white women. This racial tension is evident in the history of the suffrage movement, which saw black women such as Mary Church Terrell and Anna Julia Cooper working independently to ensure their voices were heard. This racism within the feminist movement, along with the class privilege of many white feminists, led to a fractured and exclusive approach that marginalized the voices and the concerns of women of colour. Women of colour, especially black women, had to navigate both racial and gender discrimination, and their struggles for equality was often dismissed or overshadowed by the demands of white feminists. The term intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, emerged as framework for understanding how different forms of oppression, which included race, gender, class, intersect and affect marginalized individuals in unique ways. Black women, for instance, face both sexism and racism, and these forms of discrimination cannot be understood in isolation from each other. Feminism, in its early and even modern forms, has been critiqued for not fully embracing the intersectional perspectives. Black feminists like Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and Patricia Hill Collins have worked to expand feminist thoughts to include the experiences and struggles of women of colour, arguing that the feminist movement must address issues like racism, economical inequality, and the legacy of slavery if it's to be truly inclusive. In conclusion, while white women's involvement in feminism historically provided many benefits, particularly in securing voting rights, the movement has often excluded or marginalized the experience of black women and other women of colour. The intersectional struggles of these women and their calls for a more inclusive anti-racist feminism has been essential to the ongoing development of the feminist movement as it exists today. Now, let's talk about the Manosphere. The Manosphere is an umbrella term for a variety of online communities that discuss issues affecting men, including masculinity, relationships, and men's rights. The movement's roots can be traced to the men's rights movement, which is MRM, which began gaining traction in the 1970s and 1980s as a reaction to the feminist movement. MRM groups focus on issues like fathers' rights in custody battles, unfair treatment in divorce courts, and the fact that men were often overlooked in discussions of gender equality. They argued that misandry, the systematic prejudice against men, was being ignored by society, especially as laws started favouring women in areas like family court and domestic violence. However, as time went on, the Manosphere grew to include other subcultures, some positive and some far more toxic. The pickup artist community, for example, it focused on teaching men how to seduce women using manipulative tactics or techniques, which some will argue leads to harmful ideas about relationships. Then there's the incels, short for involuntary celibates, a group within the Manosphere that expresses anger and frustration towards women for not giving them romantic or sexual attention. This group has been linked to violent rhetoric, especially when they start viewing women as objects of entitlement. Despite these extreme elements, the Manosphere also provides some important and positive contributions. For one, it has become a supportive system for men who feel isolated or marginalized. Issues like male mental health, suicide rates, and toxic masculinity are discussed openly in these communities. The Manosphere also gives a voice to men's struggles, such as the presumption of male guilt in domestic abuse cases or the lack of representation in areas like education, social services, and family law. These are valid issues that need attention. However, just like radical feminism, extremism within the Manosphere can be incredibly dangerous. Incels, for example, express profound resentment towards women for not giving them romantic or sexual attention, sometimes escalating to extreme violence. Similarly, the pickup artist community can promote a toxic version of masculinity, teaching men that they must manipulate or deceive women to get what they want. This promotes unhealthy attitudes towards women, objectifying them rather than seeing them as equals in relationships. I cannot forget to mention the Red Pill and MGTOW. MGTOW stands for Men Going Their Own Way. These two prominent factions within the Manosphere discusses masculinity, relationships, and social roles. The Red Pill philosophy encourages men to wake up to the realities of gender dynamics, often focusing on self-improvement, confidence, and understanding modern dating roles. MGTOW takes a more extreme approach, advocating for men to avoid relationships with women altogether, seeing them as potentially harmful or unfulfilling. The pros of these groups include empowerment, self-reliance, and a focus on personal growth. However, both communities face criticism for fostering toxic mindsets, promoting misogyny, and sometimes creating an echo chamber that discourages healthy relationships and mutual respect. Now, I must also include the fact that there's racism in the Manosphere. Within some sections of the Manosphere, particularly in the more extreme communities, there's a noticeable undercurrent of racism, including anti-black sentiments. These communities often promote harmful stereotypes about men and women of colour. For example, there's racial stereotyping of black men. In some segments of the Manosphere, black men are often depicted as hypermasculine or hypersexualized, or threats to white men and white women. These stereotypes are harmful and dehumanizing, and they reinforce racist views by reducing black men to simplistic and derogatory characters. There's misogynistic and xenophobic views. These are extreme elements of the Manosphere, often blending misogyny with xenophobia, leading to overall hostility not only towards women but also to men from ethnic minorities. This is particularly evident in the way some online communities treat men of colour as competition in the dating world, sometimes claiming that these men are unfairly taking women away from them, when I mean them taken away from white men. Also, some men from ethnic minorities are depicted as lesser in terms of their masculinity. I must also mention the passport bros phenomenon. and sex tourism. The passport bros phenomenon, a term often used in online spaces and among some members of the Manosphere, refers to a group of Western men, initially pioneered primarily by white males, but it has been adopted by other races of men from the West, who travel to foreign countries in search of relationships or sexual encounters, often with women from countries in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, and sometimes Eastern Europe. This practice is associated with a broader context of sex tourism, where men exploit gender inequalities in these regions for their own benefit. Key aspects of the passport bros trend includes sexual tourism and exploitation. The passport bro trend is closely tied to sexual tourism, where men travel to economically disadvantaged countries, often seeking to establish relationships with women they perceive as more submissive or traditional. These men often view women from these countries as less empowered, and the relationships are framed by exploitative power dynamics of race and class. This reinforces the idea that men from Western countries, especially white men, are entitled to relationships with women from poor countries. Racist and exotic attitudes. The passport bro movement often perpetuates racist and exotic views of women of color. These women are portrayed as exotic or more submissive than women in Western countries, and the idea is that they are somehow easier to date or marry. This is the central mentality of the passport bro movement. This viewpoint reduces these women to stereotypes and overlooks the complexity of their individual experiences. The role of white men in creating the passport bro trend. White men have been particularly associated with the creation of the passport bro phenomenon, as they are often the ones seeking relationships or sexual encounters in countries with poor economic conditions. The historical legacy of colonialism and exploitation also plays a role in shaping the power dynamics in these interactions, with men from wealthier countries exploiting the vulnerabilities of women from less developed nations. Cultural and social exclusion. The passport bro mentality also highlights the belief held by some in the Manosphere that they are unable to succeed in their own countries with women due to cultural and social factors, particularly feminism and the changing gender roles. This sense of exclusion and frustration is what drives some men to look abroad for relationships, often leaving behind a trail of objectification and commodification of women from different ethnicities or who come from impoverished backgrounds. Broader implications and harmful consequences. Both racism in certain corners of the Manosphere and the rise of the passport bro trend are deeply interconnected with broader issues of racial hierarchy and exploitation. These practices contribute to the normalization of racial stereotypes and the dehumanization of humans from different ethnic backgrounds. They also fuel toxic masculinity, as these men attempt to reclaim power and control in a society where they feel emasculated by the shifting gender dynamics. The passport bro trend, in particular, highlights how racism and sexism are interwoven in a global context. It reflects how men from powerful nations exploit women from marginalized backgrounds, reinforcing an unequal global power structure. Moreover, this trend harms not just women who are objectified, but also the men involved, as they participate in a cycle of exploitation that diminishes their ability to develop healthy and mutually respectful relationships between the two genders. In summary, now Western men of color have joined the passport bro movement, and you can see a numerous of YouTube videos dedicated to displaying and encouraging other men of color from the West to travel to these poorer countries with the quote-unquote traditional submissive women. Western men of color need to acknowledge that they are contributing to the perpetuation of harmful stereotypes and the dehumanization of marginalized human beings. The passport bro movement driven by some white men engaging in sex tourism, is an example of how the intersection of racism, sexism, and exploitation can play out in the real world. It highlights the need for a more intersectional approach to understanding gender, race, and power dynamics in both online spaces and in society at large. Side note, black men, be careful. Do not adopt the ways of your former oppressors. The danger of division. So where does this leave us? The key to both feminism and the manosphere is that radicalization on either side can create deeper division. Radical feminism can lead to misandry, while misogyny, found in the extreme sects of the manosphere, can potentially lead to violence towards women. Instead of solving gender inequality, both movements risk creating a greater toxic divide. I presume that the goal of both movements is to create a society where everyone's voice is heard and everyone is treated equally regardless of gender. If the focus becomes us versus them, then we miss the point of true equality, where both men and women have the right to live freely without fear, hatred, mistreatment, or violence. So what's the solution? How are we going to go forward? It starts with mutual respect and open communication between men and women. Both groups also need to work towards better ethical goals and some structural changes. Feminism should keep advocating for gender equality while also being inclusive of men's issues and the experiences of women from all racial backgrounds. The manosphere can continue to highlight the struggles that men face, but it must avoid promoting hate, entitlement, or any ideas of superiority, whether based on race or gender. Ultimately, both men and women need to be heard and supported, but in ways that don't tear each other down. Respect, inclusivity, and empathy should guide the conversations. It's about creating a world where everyone's voice matters, a world where we can address the challenges faced by both men and women without blaming or demonizing anyone. We should aim to empower both genders without diminishing the other. This starts with mutual respect, education, the promotion of empathy, and the creation of safe spaces where honest and healthy dialogue can happen, when people from both genders can feel heard and understood. This will allow both genders to move closer to create genuine equality. Not rivals, but partners. That's what true, harmonious equality looks like. But at the end of the day, both movements have the potential to create a better world for both genders to live in, facilitating the creation of better, healthier relationships amongst the two genders, both professionally and romantically, potentially anyway. But the trap of extremism in both movements, fueled by fear, hurt, anger, and hatred, will only lead to chaos. We all need to approach these gender-related issues with the willingness to listen, learn, and heal, and to commit to the progress of both genders. Yet, I do wonder how many fortunes bloom from the seeds of strife sown between men and women. But what do I know? I'm just a cartoon.